Good morning, and thank you for coming so early to hear me speak. And I apologize that I can't speak in French. Here we are. Okay, so today we're going to start by talking about reading. And I always think about learning to read as the most important milestone of a child's education. And the reason for that is that reading provides us access to so many things. It provides us access to knowledge, it provides us access to work, to social benefits, social integration, democracy. It helps to keep us healthy, and it helps to keep us safe. And the ubiquity of reading is set against the fact that it is not a universal part of human experience. So unlike learning to understand and to speak, we are not born to read. Instead, reading is a learned skill that requires years of instruction, dedication, and practice. And for you as teachers, I often think that teaching people to read is one of the most important functions of the state, because by bringing people into the world of literacy, you provide them access to so many things throughout their lives. So despite this, low literacy continues to be a huge problem. Results of the PISA study consistently show that about 1 in 5 children in Western Europe lacks the foundational literacy skills by the age of 15 to participate effectively in life. And what that means to lack foundational literacy skills is that if they're given a piece of text, they cannot find the main point. Just imagine the costs of that for individuals, for society, and the economy. Low literacy effectively puts a brake on economic development. And that's why it's a huge problem. It's imperative that we get this right. And I want to show you just what low literacy looks like. This is a type of question that a 15-year-old might not be able to do in Western Europe. So here we see, this is an alert. It's about the lemon cream biscuits. There's nuts in them, and you can immediately see this. But here the question is, what's the purpose of this? Is it to warn about the biscuits? Is it to advertise about the biscuits? This is an easy question for you, but not for a child who has low literacy by the age of 15. So despite the importance of literacy for children and for adults all through their lives, we've seen decades of raging debate over the best way to teach children to read. And really, this has been, well, it goes back 200 years, but it's been most vociferous in the last 40 years. And it's really focused on the very earliest stages of the process of learning to read. And that is when children begin to map visual symbols onto the sounds and meanings of spoken language. And on one perspective, this stage of reading is seen as a time for explicit instruction in how those visual symbols map onto sounds. But on the other perspective, this is seen as a chance for children to be immersed in a literacy-rich environment and basically through that immersion, learn how to map these visual symbols onto the sounds and meanings of language. Now, this has been particularly vociferous because reading, in effect, has become a touchstone for a much more general debate about the role of the child and the teacher in education. Right? So it's touching on deep-seated perspectives on educational philosophy and even political orientation. But what I'm here to tell you is that reading isn't about philosophy or political orientation. Reading is a scientific problem. And the last 50 years of research in psychology has provided sufficient evidence to end the reading wars. So what is reading? If I give you a sentence like this, what do you need to do to that? You need to do many things. It's a task of immense complexity. So we might need to analyze those visual forms. What do those dots and squiggles look like? We might need to analyze what the individual letters are and their positions so that we get to the right word. We might need to say, well, what do these bits of words mean? Like in decided, what does that ed mean? It means the past. Well, what about the language that's being used? What is meant by cut and run? That's figurative language, and it demands a higher level of language ability. We need to use background knowledge, maybe inferencing skills. Why is it that Jess has to cut and run? All of this demands working memory, executive skills, and of course, once we're skilled readers, all of these abilities are mixed into an exquisitely tuned eye movement system, where our eyes dance across the page in a way that helps us to understand the text. The immense complexity of reading is one of the reasons for the reading wars. People have rightly said, well, I can read. This is what I do when I read. So I need to teach all of these skills. But that doesn't follow. We don't need to teach all of these skills at the same time. And I often talk about other domains of skilled behavior. So for example, take chess. If you look at chess grandmasters, experts in chess, what they tell you is that they don't see individual pieces. They see the whole game. They strategize. They plan miles in advance, right? Now, if we're teaching somebody to play chess, that's not what we do. We don't teach them to see the whole game. We teach them what the pieces are. How much is each piece worth? How can you move each piece? And so too, that's what we need to do when we teach people to learn to read. So reading, first of all, starts with oral language. And we heard some wonderful talks yesterday about how oral language starts even from the moment of birth. Now, if we don't have oral language of these concepts, for example, a hen, a pen, what 10 is, we are going to have real problems learning to read. And that's why people who are born deaf or people with low language always struggle to learn to read. There's much evidence around this. So we know that language skill in the early years predicts reading comprehension later. We know that interventions in the early years around language help to teach children how to read and help them comprehend later. And for you as teachers, what's really important to know is that at school entry, there's enormous variation in language ability. And a recent study suggested that 2 children in every classroom of around 30 enter school with low language, without the foundational language to be able to learn to read. Now, presuming that we have good oral language at school entry, the challenge of learning to read is to map spellings, the visual symbols that make up words, those squiggles, dots, and lines, onto spoken language. And remember that this is a learned task, right? This is not like learning to speak. Now, how the brain solves that problem depends on the writing system. Now, writing systems are all expressions of spoken language, but they differ considerably. So here we have Korean. Korean is an alphabetic language, so it maps visual symbols onto sounds very precisely, almost in a one-to-one way. And what you can see is that the visual symbols that make up the letters are in the shapes of the articulatory organs that would be needed to produce them, right? And so Korean, in a sense, provides a direct line into spoken language. Very different for Chinese. Chinese, you can pull these characters apart to some extent, but it really is a task of learning each character and its meaning by rote through the whole course of reading acquisition. A very difficult task. Braille is very different again. So in Braille, we have the Braille cell, those raised dots, representing letters, groups of letters, or even words. And of course, many languages use the Roman alphabet to depict the language. And those languages that do, even so, they vary considerably in the transparency with which those letters map onto sounds. So I'm going to be talking about alphabetic systems, such as French and English. So when we're thinking about how to map spellings onto spoken language, we have 2 choices, but they're not equivalent. We can map spellings directly onto meanings, and after all, reading is about meaning. But what we can see is that this relationship in an alphabetic language is highly arbitrary. Right? So we have words like hen, pen, and 10. They look similar, but they don't have similar meanings. And that type of learning is very, very hard for humans. On the other side, I will say that in English and French, which have massive vocabularies, Memorizing every single word is just not tenable in the first years of reading instruction. And some people say, well, isn't that exactly what happens in Chinese? And to a certain extent it is, but in Chinese, learning 4,000 characters is sufficient for full literacy. In something like English, you need to learn 70,000. Right? So it's a very different task. The other choice we have in mapping spellings onto language is to try to map spellings onto sounds. And here you can see we've got hen, pen, and ten, words that look similar, and they also sound similar. Right? And so by learning this relationship between spelling and sound, that then provides us the hook or the access to that spoken language knowledge that we've started school with. And when we talk about phonics, that's exactly what phonics is trying to do. It's trying to teach this relationship between the spellings of words and the sounds that they represent so that children can make use of that oral language foundation. Now note that each time you learn a word along this pathway, that enables you to generalize to other words. So it helps you to learn new words. So we might learn net, and that will be easier because we've learned hen and pen and ten. Now, many people say, well, do we really need to teach this explicitly? And there's old debates about whether this is actually barking at print, right? This rigid phonics instruction. There's been a lot of research on this. And what this research has shown is that indeed, if children do not have explicit instruction, some of them will eventually learn this, but many or most won't. And in my own lab, we do these sorts of experiments with adults, trying to teach them to read in new scripts. And we find the same thing, that even skilled readers, around 75%, fail to learn without explicit instruction. And I think that this is very different from what we've heard yesterday, because yesterday we heard Professor Kuhl talking about how babies learn without effort. That is not the case for reading, because remember that we are not born to read. It has to be taught. Now, I think one of the most seductive arguments against the idea of systematic phonics has come around shared book reading. And shared book reading is a wonderful thing for all sorts of reasons, primarily the fact that it helps to build language knowledge. But shared book reading will not teach you how to read. Right? So this is a little study of looking at the eye movements of 4- and 5-year-old children when they're engaging in shared book reading with a caregiver. And what you can see, the circles are showing where the eyes are, and you can see that those eyes are not on the text. Right? So whatever the case, children should be read to. I'm having trouble with the clicker. Children should be read to, but this is not a way to build print knowledge without other forms of systematic instruction. Now, England has embarked on a very interesting experiment over the last 10 years. Around 2007, it became mandatory for schools to teach systematic phonics from the first point of reading instruction. And in England, children start school at the age of 4. Right? So that is when reading instruction starts. So in 2007, there was an understanding amongst teachers and schools that they should be teaching phonics. But in 2012, the government did something else. They implemented a screening task at the end of year 1. And that's when children are 5 or 6 years old. And in this screening task, every child simply reads 20 words and 20 non-words. And the non-words are things like VIB, VIB. Right? And what this tells us is whether children have learned that relationship between spelling and sound so precisely that they can apply it to words that they don't know. For those children who fail at year 1, there's an intervention, and then they take the test again at year 2 when they're 6 or 7. And these are the data, and I think there's many interesting things about these data. The blue line is the initial test at year 1. The red line is for those children who don't pass in year 1, they take it again in year 2. The first point to note is that by 2012, most schools and teachers were saying, we use phonics. But what you can see is that that year, only 58% of children passed the screening test after 2 years of reading instruction. So something about that provision just wasn't good enough to instill this knowledge in children. And what you can see from 2000 forward is that there have been dramatic increases in children's performance over those years. Right? And around 700,000 children take this screening test every year. And so every single percent that's driven up, that reflects thousands of children having the foundational skills to learn to become successful readers. What you can also see is that for those children who fail on the first attempt, they have their intervention. We're getting to the point where every child in an English primary school will leave primary school with the foundational tools to become a successful reader. Now, one question is there any lasting benefit? Is there any broader benefit to this phonics training? And those studies are still being conducted. There was a very interesting study that came out last year in an economics journal, which looked at the rollout of this program in 2007, because it was rolled out from school district to school district. And what they found was that the implementation of systematic phonics at a whole school district level had broader benefits for all children in national exams the next year, and for those children who entered school at risk of reading failure because of low SES or because of English as an additional language, those children were still benefiting from this provision at the age of 11, right? So phonics is good for all children, but it's particularly vital for some children. Now, as we move into adulthood, we're still using our phonics, right, to encounter new words, to compute the meanings of words that we know. But what researchers have found is that this process is relatively slow, it's attention demanding, and even if we're very proficient at linking spellings onto sounds, that is not the same as spoken language. In spoken language, we have gesture, we have eye movements, we have audiovisual cues, we have intonation, and those things are always absent in text. Right? So text, just translating to sound, is not good enough to become a skilled reader. Something else is important. And what researchers think is that ultimately, you have to develop a relationship between the spellings of words and their meanings directly. And one of the predominant theories in this area suggests that what children are doing is they're building expertise across many years, and they're using their phonics knowledge to self-teach this mapping. So each time we're using our phonics to read a word, to access the meaning, we're building that link between spellings and meanings. Right? And that takes a long time. And the other thing to note, as teachers, there is huge variation in children's exposure to text. And we know that text experience is very, very important in becoming a skilled reader. So one study suggested that by grade 5, the bottom 10% of children were getting on the order of 60,000 words per year, whereas the top 10% were getting on the order of 6 million words per year. Right? So one thing we often hear is that it's not phonics that's important, it's to develop a love of reading, right? And loving reading and a love of learning, reading for pleasure, this is very important, right? But what we know is that phonics instruction doesn't prevent that, it enables it. So starting children off with good oral language, phonics provides them the tools to become an independent reader and thus develop this mapping. So what are children doing when they're getting all of this text experience? Well, for one, they're learning individual words, but they're also learning a different type of word. So in languages such as French and English, most words are not the simple words that I showed you at the beginning. They're more complicated, right? They're linking different elements of words. And this is an English example, right? So develop, develops, developing, developed, developers. Right? If you know about the morphology of the language, you know that these 15 words are all versions of the same word. Right? You don't have to learn all of those individually. And these types of words are very interesting because all of a sudden, they provide some regularity between the mapping between spelling and meaning. So we see these words all look similar and they mean the same things, right? And these affixes at the end, like ed, those are consistently recurring, and they change the meanings of words in highly predictable ways. And what we know, by the time children become into late adolescence, age 15 and 16, and into becoming skilled readers as adults, they're using this information to pull words apart very rapidly to get at the meanings of those words, right? And that all develops through text experience, really over 10 years of reading experience. Now, I haven't yet talked about text, and the reason is that the foundations of reading are really about learning single words. But we're interested in text, right? Ultimately, that's the task that children need to be able to get to grips with. And this is a difficult passage, and it's even more difficult because it's in English. But this is an example from one of the national exams that children take in England at the age of 10 or 11. Right? And it's from a reading comprehension exam. And I just want to point out a few things. The first is that if by this time you don't have fluent word recognition of single words, you don't have a chance at being able to understand this, right? Learning to become a fluent reader of single words enables you to release cognitive resources so that you can focus on higher level comprehension difficulties, right? So what we say is that learning to become a fluent recognizer of words is necessary, but it's not sufficient. The second point to make is that text is far more complicated than spoken language. Text has much richer vocabulary. It has more complicated syntax. And many studies have shown this. So if we look at this passage, we see words like poignant and bygone. And I can tell you what, 10-year-olds don't talk like that in the playground. Right? We have phrases like a great generosity of space instead of the word big, right? And I think that this is very interesting because what it means is that learning to read is not just about mapping visual symbols onto your existing language knowledge. Once we become literate, language becomes something different, and literate individuals develop their language through text. And I think that this here illustrates why shared book reading can be very important, even into the adolescent years. So when you read with a child, even an adolescent, you're typically reading material that they can't read themselves. So when you read text like this, you're developing their language knowledge in a way that they can't do themselves. And a final point is that language through text is different than spoken language. And when children enter the circle of literacy, they have access to these new layers of language. And when you as teachers help your pupils to become literate individuals, you also provide the bridge into this new realm of language experience. So to summarize, reading begins with oral language. Everything begins there, and we really have to think about what happens between the ages of about birth and 3 or 4 to make sure that children are starting school with those good language foundations. Systematic phonics for all children helps them to become successful and independent readers by giving them the foundational tools to link those arbitrary visual symbols onto the sounds of spoken language. But finally, that's necessary, it's not sufficient, because text experience is necessary to build that fluency and to release our cognitive resources for higher level text comprehension and to build vocabulary. Now, if you're interested in this area, I just wanted to advertise a paper that we've recently written about the insights we've discovered from the last 50 years of reading research and the implications for instruction. And we've written this in a way that we hope is accessible to teachers and the general public to inform your practice. And we've drawn out the instructional principles from that literature. And what we argue is that it's time to end the reading wars, and we should be adopting an instructional agenda that's developmentally informed and based on a deep understanding of how language and writing systems work. And you can find that paper free free to access on the web address provided. So thank you very much.